What can we learn from Ontario's Universal Basic Income pilot? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. AI and automation are topics that are coming up in more and more people's minds because it really does relate to the prospects of employability for our society. Are there going to be jobs left for ordinary people once the robots come? Will technology be able to outpace humanity when it comes to providing useful skills in the workplace? These questions are bothering people because it calls into question two things. First of all, your purpose. A lot of people tie their jobs to their meaning. That's what they do. They spend a lot of time at it, and they derive an income to do things like raise a family. And the second thing people are wondering is if you take that away, not only will we lose some semblance of meaning and structure and order in our lives, but how do we provide? Where do we get money from? These are the questions that have to be asked probably in the coming decade. Now, one popular answer to these inquiries is UBI, a universal basic income. And what this does, it basically gives you, every citizen in a country, a certain amount of money every month. The idea isn't for you to live lavishly off it, but it enables you to live, to not be homeless, and to have a bare minimum living standard guaranteed for all people. Now, UBI does come with its problems. Contrary to some people's opinions, it's not perfect. It has some flaws that we have to iron out, as I'm going to point out in today's episode. But to me, it's a very intriguing idea because it presents to us a prospect of income equality, giving people a baseline, ensuring that in the worst case scenario, you're still going to be able to live. You won't be wondering where your next meal comes from because you have money in your pocket to deal with that. Now, you might not be able to afford a super nice sofa or a big TV or a new car, but at the very least, you're not staring down the barrel of complete destitution. The facts of the matter are clear though. UBI is popular. People like Andrew Yang have made a name for themselves by advocating for it, but we don't fully understand what UBI means and what it can do to people, what it can do for people, and how it's best to approach handling it. But we have some semblance of evidence. The Ontario Basic Income Pilot Project was supposed to prove to us whether or not UBI could work. It was set to provide 4,000 residents with UBI payments over a length of time to observe the effects it had on them. It was implemented by Kathleen Wynne, Ontario's previous Liberal Premier, and it ran for a little while, but it was terminated by Doug Ford when he took office. Now, it was supposed to go on for a span of 3 years, but it was cut short. I believe it was only about a year, maybe less. Interestingly enough, though, they didn't truly randomize the participants in the study when it was running. To me, that was a major mistake. The purpose of this entire thing was to discover the feasibility of UBI for Ontario, for even Canada, but for everyone. Not just a niche, it was supposed to uncover how UBI would interact with society at large. What the researchers mistakenly did was they set a limit that barred certain groups of people from entering the study. You had to earn under $34,000 to qualify, which obviously impacts the way things are going to play out. The results are going to reflect that because the criteria are going to come with a certain set of biases and predispositions. To be truthful, this research more accurately represented how people earning very little in Ontario would react to a UBI. That's not particularly useful because not everyone in Ontario earns under $34,000 per year. We want to see how the middle class would react, how the poor as well, but also how the rich would. We wanted to get a blend of everyone to truly represent how a city or a society would function given this UBI. So to my mind, that was a massive failure, but there were still things that we can look at to learn from. The terms of the study were set like this. If you were a single individual, in other words, you didn't have a spouse, you'd receive roughly $17,000 per year. That works out to be around $1,400 per month. That's a pretty decent amount of change to be getting on top of whatever job you had prior. Now, here's the interesting part, which to me is another failure of the study. Couples were given roughly $24,000 instead. I just told you that the individual, someone who's single, would get $17,000. Now the rules say a couple will get $24,000. To me, this is ridiculous, and it lays out why pilots like this are needed in the first place. if we are seriously considering UBI, we have to make sure that we know what we're doing. Bad implementation, bad policy, and bad rules would be disastrous. You have to ask yourself here, what happens when you pay couples less money than people who are single? Obviously, people are going to be de-incentivized to enter a relationship because they get less money. You're better off being single from a financial standpoint. You can extrapolate this trend or this rule into a broader context, and you can imagine what kind of effects that would have on society. First of all, people will probably not want to enter a relationship. Getting less money because of that doesn't make sense, and already our birth rates are declining in Canada. You want to make that problem worse? Here's one way to do it. Pay people less money, effectively tax them for being with somebody. And the flip side of that is people may still get together, but now they're going to lie to you. They're going to find ways to circumvent this paperwork so they end up getting their $17,000. How can you even verify if someone is with someone or not? Being married is a clear tell sign, but maybe this makes a rise in things like common law relationships or people just not disclosing those kind of details to the government. I don't see how this would be any type of a good idea. To me, it comes across as a cost savings in a bad spot. Now, of course, I understand if you have a significant other, you guys can split certain costs and you can save money through that. So maybe the researchers want to reflect that in this UBI payment because they have the opportunity to spread these fixed costs over more people, but at the same time, you de-incentivize certain behavior by doing that. And that's a key trend here with the UBI. You have to keep in mind, this is going to have effects when it comes to you socially. It's not just money being given to you to do whatever you want. When you attach stipulations to it, those are going to come with consequences, and we have to be aware of that. Imagine this policy going live across all of Canada. I'm pretty sure in a short span of time, marriages, relationships will fall off a cliff, and presumably birth rates would decline as well. These are not things that are inherently good for society. I'm not too sure why we'd be actively selecting for them. Now, the second failure within the guidelines was this. The amount of basic income would be reduced by 50 cents for every dollar of earned income. In other words, you lose 50% of your UBI in equivalent terms to your wages. If you make $1 from a job, your UBI goes down by 50 cents. Once again, we have to ask ourselves, what happens when we penalize people for working? In the first example, we penalize you for being with someone. Now, they're setting up a rule where you are penalized for finding a job. It's really a question of incentives. The behavior that you incentivize is going to materialize in a way that's going to either be good for society or bad for it. So, you better be damn sure that you set up the game optimally. You better make sure you reward people for things that you want to see and you don't penalize them for things that you would like. This to me sounds bad. Even though we have a UBI, we still want people to engage in the economy. If you have a skill set that is desirable in the workplace, sure, find a job, make use of that. For us to tell you that you're going to lose a percentage of your UBI because you are trying to find employment makes no sense. It actually incentivizes you to not have a job, to not do these kind of things with your time. I'm not too sure that's the path that we want to go down. Now, from the policymaker's standpoint, they might be telling themselves something like, oh, if you are able to earn an income, you don't need as much of this money from the government, so therefore we're going to cut it and give it to someone who can find a job. But when you do that, it's like a hamster wheel. It's going to rotate and you're going to end up with an undesirable consequence. If you tell people you working is going to result in a net loss of the money we give you, someone might look at that and just not be as motivated to find a job anymore. They might say, forget that. I don't want to lose 50% of my UBI for working. If I'm working, I should be earning more money at a higher rate. I shouldn't be sacrificing because I am an active member of the economy. So you're going to encounter resistance there. A UBI only works when it's universal, when you aren't penalized for doing certain things like being in a relationship or finding a job. These stipulations to me were completely foolish. If you want your UBI to fail, if you want your society to just be a bunch of single people, if you want the employment market to crash, these are the ways you should go about it, by attaching these strings to how people perceive their funding. So today, the CBC writes about some of the key findings of the study during its short tenure. The first thing they write is the study shows that nearly 75% of respondents who were working when the pilot project began kept working despite getting the UBI. Now think about that. To me, it's an obvious finding. The fact that they found that interesting spells out to me that they aren't grasping the relevance of context here. People kept their jobs because they knew it was a trial. I'm actually surprised it wasn't even a higher number. If you put somebody in a UBI pilot and you say it's going to run for a maximum of 3 years, who in their right mind would quit their job because of that? Who wouldn't continue to pursue employment because they know when this timeline runs out, they're going to be thrust back into the economy? The reaction of the participants is very different than someone in a context where you tell them UBI is a government policy now across all of Canada for the foreseeable future. We want this to be a thing for everyone because we know AI is here and it's going to stay. In that case, they might say, okay, this seems to be a reasonable bet that UBI is going to be taken away in a couple years, so maybe I can get by with not keeping this job. To me, this piece of data wasn't all that valuable because it doesn't tell us much. The contexts are very different between the study and what would happen in the real world. Now, here's some good data in contrast. 80% of respondents reported better overall health. More than half of them said that they were using less tobacco, and 40% responded that they were drinking less. These are pretty amazing findings. Keep in mind, the participants of this study earned a relatively low income. The improved health is a major benefit of UBI. That's true in both the mental and physical dimensions. If you have a relatively low standard of living, presumably you're going to be worried about a lot of things, like first of all, how you're going to eat, how you're going to pay your rent. Do you have money to bring your kids to an after-school activity? Can you provide? Can you save money for your retirement? Can you save money for your kids' education fund? All these questions are going to be running through your mind on a daily basis, and it's going to take a toll on you. You're going to be anxious. You might encounter some depression. You might lose motivation to keep going because it feels like you're just running around in the same cycle. You make money, you lose all of it to pay your bills, and you have nothing to build towards your future. And from the physical standpoint, your diet might be composed of things that aren't that good for you because your time is running out. You have to bounce from job to job. You can't cook meals. You have to rely on fast food. Those things aren't good for you. You have no time to go to the gym. This UBI permits you some of that time back to make those choices again. In a sense, you are less burdened by the constraints of your financial situation. You are free to do some things that really matter for you and things that are going to better your overall condition. Those are great things. And the alcohol and tobacco usage declining is also noteworthy. It's almost as if these people aren't seeking ways to escape reality anymore. If your world is flipped upside down and everything you do doesn't feel important, if you feel like you're not progressing in life, if you feel like things are just overall crappy, you might look to things like alcohol to take away that pain. You might try to get yourself drunk to forget about that, or you might be constantly smoking to relieve stress. That might come from the factors I listed before. You might want to be taking numerous smoke breaks because you just need a second to yourself to think. Now, we're seeing here that 50% of participants reduced their rates of consumption for these things that are obviously bad for you. Smoking and drinking alcohol, there is no good that comes from that. Maybe alcohol in moderation, but smoking, definitely not. We see here a correlation between increasing the standard of living and people making better decisions for themselves. That's a great thing that we want to incentivize in society. We don't want to incentivize you to not find a job, but something like this, improving your health, feeling less stressed, being able to give up some of the terrible habits that you have, those are great. And the UBI seems to point as something that's helping people find these answers for themselves. They also had some specific mental health figures, and these are as follows. 83% of people felt less stressed, and 81% felt more self-confident. Participants reported that they were able to get things like better food, better housing security, they were able to go to the doctor less often due to things like better diets, and 66% of people reported better relationships with family members. Money and time are correlated heavily. We trade time to earn capital, sometimes to our own detriment. When you have a steady flow of capital or income, you are free to pursue things that are more meaningful, like maybe building a relationship with your family, your children, or your loved ones, maybe even your friends. In the grand scheme of things, few items really matter. A 40-hour work week doing something you simply put up with to provide for a family isn't exactly the pinnacle of human meaning for most people. Letting citizens pursue what matters to them via economic freedom is something we should strive towards. With the power of technology, I don't see why we can't make this happen. The sad news here, though, is that once the pilot was finished, the project, the participants largely had to abandon their new habits and revert to their past behaviors. One of the researchers points out that we don't have the data to understand the long-run patterns, and it's a shame the study was canceled, and that's a fact. I'd say the rules of this pilot were flawed, as I've outlined, but we don't know to what extent this data even holds true. So we do have some inclination as to what a UBI can do for you. It can make you feel more secure, it can get rid of stress, it can do X, Y, and Z. We have to get to the core of how to make this happen and how to make it happen responsibly. We have to study how the human psyche reacts to something like this stimulus by not having the need to seek out a job, by being, in some sense, babied by the government where you're able to just sit at home and be provided for. How does that affect people? We need more data on these topics. It's really clear that we have to learn more and perfect our formula before things go live. If we put out a UBI that makes no sense and comes with disastrous consequences, we might as well have not done it in the first place. And since we're on the topic, I should spell out that I'm optimistic about UBI. I'm a fan. It makes sense to me, but at the same time, I'm critical about it. Like with most things, because I understand the ways in which we go about it that matters. To botch the process would be disastrous to not only the public's perception of the idea, but also to the long-term feasibility of something I'd regard as imperative given the impending AI revolution. The fact that majority of people's skill sets are not going to be desirable in the workplace anymore. How do we handle that? UBI is not the only answer, but it's one that we should take seriously and look into. And if I was going to lay out the 3 priorities for UBI right now, I'd say the first thing to consider is how UBI will play out in the world of politics. There is no doubt in my mind that it's going to fundamentally shift the way that we go about things like elections. A UBI is something that everyone's going to campaign on. It's almost an easy way to get votes. Who's not going to vote for someone who's going to give you more money directly into your pocket? We don't want an election cycle where candidate A comes out and says, hey, I'm going to raise UBI to $1,200. And B comes out and says, hey, I'm going to make it 13. And then they go back and forth until they reach a ludicrous amount that our ecosystem cannot handle. Just because somebody wants to be in office, they might go to those lengths. They might disregard the feasibility of it and promise you something that they know that you want. It's very tempting, and to me, it's a black box that should be avoided. We can't get into this bickering match where people are trying to up the ante on each other to the detriment of society. UBI has to be calculated by an independent body and administered by them. It has to be free from political influence because we're going to get into a war each and every election. This can't be something that people are campaigning on. A very obvious outcome of that is someone comes along, promises you a ridiculous UBI amount to get your votes, and then they try to implement it, and our country just goes kaput. We can't afford it, everyone goes bankrupt, and that's the end of it. We end up like the end result of a communist regime where we've established equality, but everyone's poor now. That's something to be avoided at all costs, and I do think that we have to set up an independent body. Something like the Bank of Canada, which controls interest rates, supposedly free from influence. A UBI mechanism or department would need to be something like that as well. These are the conversations that we're not having, and it's going to matter if this thing ever goes live. Now, once we figure that part out, to me the second step is to answer the question as to how do we pay for it? To me, the simplest answer comes in the form of a tax on efficiency. Companies are not going to need to spend as much money hiring people or labor because the machines can do it more efficiently and more cheap. They don't have to pay them overtime, no benefits. They don't have to pay them anything actually. They pay their fee to get the machine, and then there is some maintenance here and there. That's a massive cost savings to the company. My idea is we try to quantify that. We say, based on your financials, it looks like these robots are saving you 30% or something like that. We're going to come in and take 10% of that maybe, just a little bit off the top, and we're going to use that to fund society. You are reaping the benefits of automation. You're getting a lot of money now. Your profit margin is expanding, and society is suffering because they don't have jobs anymore. It's your responsibility to help us out because you're benefiting on the backs of people who can't work for you anymore. And at the same time, this is a codependent relationship. The companies need people to buy from them. If the populace has no more money because nobody can work, they're going out of business. This has to go both ways. So you're going to save a lot of money, you're going to make some insane profits, but some of that's coming back to us in the form of taxes, and we're going to give people money who can then use that in the economy, thus creating a win-win situation. I don't think this has to come via taxing the rich. That's probably going to be a big campaign slogan, but to me that's set for failure. The rich may not be as dependent on the Canadian consumer as a corporation would be. A rich person might say, hey, forget these taxes, I'm going to flee the country and go somewhere where they don't exist. I don't need you to buy anything from me. I'm an individual who makes some money off of investments and whatnot, whatever the case may be. But a corporation operating in Canada, it needs customers. Their suffering is going to be correlated to the suffering of the working class person who has no money to buy anything, because that means no income for the company. Now, of course, we have to find a fair balance and work out the numbers here, but to me, that's the path. We have to understand what the viable sources of funding are and make sure we don't stray too far away from it. We don't want to alienate the rich and make them flee Canada, which is a net loss to everyone. Less taxes, less intellectual capital, less investment, and whatnot. We have to be smart about this. And after that's figured out, to me, the third thing that we have to do is we have to ensure that we don't become blobs of meat without purpose. Given this foreseeable increase in available time from, first of all, not having a job anymore and getting a UBI, you're going to have a lot of room to do more things in your life. You need to be able to maneuver that in a way that gives you a reason to live. For a lot of people, their raison d'etre, reason to be, was simply just to work and make money to provide for your family and whatnot, to climb the corporate ladder. And that's not true for everyone, but I'm sure it's applicable to a large subset of the population. When you take that away, you take away a structure. When you have a job, it's very clearly laid out for you. You work these hours, you do this, and your free time is your free time. Now, with your free time going up, that means more control for you. What are you going to do with it? If you want to sit around and do nothing, that's going to be quite depressing. In fact, it might just be detrimental to the human soul. It will be one of the first times in all of human history that you don't have to do anything anymore to survive. You don't have to hunt, you don't have to gather, you don't even need a job. You can just sit and you'll be fine. What does that do to people? This is a question that can't be answered by the government. It's much more philosophical. It's something to talk about. Do we have a plan for this? How are we going to make sure that we don't lose meaning and enter a void of nihilism? That's on the rise right now. Even without the UBI, people are losing a sense of meaning in their life. They're turning to depression. They're thinking life is not worth anything. Nothing really matters. To me, the UBI might compound that if we don't have an answer. If we don't figure out what we're really trying to do. Do we have a goal as a collective, as a society, as an individual? What is our mission? Are we going to place a greater emphasis on things like relationships? Are we going to spend a lot of time with our families or our girlfriends or our boyfriends or whatever? Are we going to try and discover what love really is? Are we going to become very artistic as a society? People who are doing things like producing media for consumption because you have a lot of time. Maybe art and films and movies and music pick up. Maybe, we don't even know what the possibilities are here, but it will do us a lot of good to start thinking about it. What would our lives look like when we don't have to work anymore? That could happen very soon. These 3 steps here are things to talk about, but all we're hearing in the media is, hey, I'm going to give you $1,000 every month and you better vote for me. That's a mistake. Without the nuance, we run the risk of administering a terrible system. We only have one shot at this, it seems to me. To fail at this first attempt will be disastrous for everyone. If we are going to implement a UBI, we better do it right, and that starts with conversations like this. So, that now brings me to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoy the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram @PerryPlatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.